Joining me now is one of our favorite analysts, and he's a professor of American Studies at the University of Birmingham. Mr. Scott Lewis is here with us today. Scott, good to see you again. All right, we've been talking every day virtually with you, and we appreciate the time that you're taking to talk to us each day. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about these sanctions that have been put into place, but not the energy side. Is that because the energy is going to be used as a sort of final bullet or the final nail in the coffin when it comes to Russia? Or is it used strategically? Or is it because America and EU really can't do with adding energy sanctions?
No, I think you had it right, which is it is another step which could be taken. But remember, it has already been taken in part because Germany has already suspended the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, which potentially could have brought billions of dollars into revenue into Russia this year. Nord Stream 1 still operates. Whether that pipeline would be cut off or limited, of course, well, you do measure up the effect it would have on Europe's gas reserves, even as we come out of the winter months. But I think the big news here is that the steps that have already been taken, especially the steps to freeze the assets of the Russian central bank, have already had a significant damaging effect on the Russian economy. The freeze on assets means the central bank cannot use foreign currency reserves to prop up the economy, and the ruble, as a result, has dropped 30% alone this morning. That means you've got Russian citizens queuing at ATMs at banks, worried they can't get their money out before the banks effectively start operating. So there's an immediate impact which is being felt of the sanctions already in place. Part of the reason why Vladimir Putin has been so frustrated and why he issued this, quote, nuclear alert yesterday.
Do you think Putin is using as much? I mean, it doesn't feel like he's using his full might against Ukraine. It seems like he was like testing the waters a little bit, sending a few troops here and there. I don't feel like Russia's used its full weight behind them. Is this tactical, or is it he can't afford to, or he's not sure of himself? I mean, I'm surprised.
That's a really good observation that we haven't seen the full potential weight of the Russians, but that's because they have failed in the initial stage. The idea that the Russian military had, that Putin had, is that beginning last Thursday at the start of the invasion, they very quickly could put elite forces inside Ukrainian cities, especially the capital, Kiev. So you detain, you kill the president, Vladimir Zelensky, you kill his ministers or detain them, you detain MPs, and the Ukrainian government would collapse. But that failed. They failed to get those elite forces into Kiev. They failed yesterday to get forces into Kharkiv, the second largest city in Ukraine, up in the northeast. Because what Putin had wanted to do was, all right, we are going to do some shelling, we're going to do some attacks, but we'll take these cities relatively intact because you don't want a damaged Ukraine that you occupy because it's a further drain on the Russian economy, and the Ukrainians will not greet you as liberators. Now, that initial stage has been hindered, if not failed. If it doesn't proceed, does Putin proceed with the fallback, which is the mass bombardment? And we're talking not only shells, we're talking missiles, we're talking bombs, which is the type of tactic the Russians used in Chechnya 20 years ago and used more recently in Syria. The upside is they might finally be able to suppress the Ukrainian resistance. The downside is they then have broken and effectively bought a Ukraine that will not be an economic asset, but will be an economic liability, and I suspect a political liability given the insurgency to come for years.
Indeed, a good point. You know, we said about these nuclear defense, nuclear defense deterrence or whatever. Is this to scare the West or to scare these sanctions? Because he says that, you know, they're unfounded sanctions that were put on him. But is this just to scare? Is this part of the game? He's not going to release nuclear weapons, surely?
It was a guy who was frustrated, who was angry, who was stomping his feet that he hadn't yet taken control of Ukraine. And he was lashing out with this idea, you know, that I'll put the nuclear forces on alert. Because he then followed up and said, oh, this is because of the illegitimate sanctions, right, which shows he is being affected by them. And then, bizarrely, because of statements, provocative statements from the West. And why do I say bizarrely? The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov today said, oh, it was a statement that came from the British Foreign Minister, Liz Truss. Now, with respect, the British Foreign Minister, Liz Truss, is not the most prominent politician in terms of Western military or even diplomatic maneuvers. And as far as I could tell, the most provocative statement she made in the past 24 hours was saying that Britons could go and fight inside Ukraine, which is an interesting statement, but not necessarily one which is threatening nuclear war on Moscow.
Indeed, indeed. But would that, I mean, could this be like a provocation to, would Putin want NATO forces in Ukraine? I mean, just to scale things up, to sort of like think, well, now you're here, you know what, I'm now going to bring out the big guns. Could that be a ploy?
Putin would love NATO forces in Ukraine. Yeah. He would love forces from the US, the UK, from Europe, from Turkey to step foot in Ukraine, because then he gets to play the victim narrative that he has basically had to do this because he was under threat from NATO. And they're not going to take the bait. I mean, there are going to be no foreign forces that are going to go into Ukraine. Instead, and again, this is what has rattled Putin, in the last 72 hours, we've seen an uptick in military equipment going to Ukraine so they can fight for themselves. And significantly, the first equipment since 1939 from Sweden for another country under attack, and the first equipment in history by Germany, or post-1945 Germany, and by the European Union. These are unprecedented steps that are being taken, still limited, but are showing the extent of what could be a long-term support for Ukraine to be militarily at least able to resist Russian occupation. And let me add one other step, which we've got this morning to watch. The European Union is going to consider an urgent application from Ukraine for membership. Wow. Under what Vladimir Zelensky called a special new process. Now, can you imagine a fast-track Ukraine going into the EU? If that's the case, Vladimir Putin's move, which was to distance Ukraine from NATO and the European Union, has backfired spectacularly unless he can conquer the country very quickly.
Indeed. But what would that mean if they suddenly took the, I mean, it's not something that can happen overnight, really, just a few votes, carrots?
It's a process that takes time. I mean, Turkey knows from its own bitter experience how long it takes to get into the EU. But it is a process which could begin, and you could take the initial steps, going to the European Council, then going to the Commission to say, we'll consider it in principle. And that alone is a hugely symbolic step. Remember, a lot of what we see in these campaigns, beyond remembering that people are dying, it is fought out on the level of symbolism. And the symbolism right now is that far from detaching Ukraine from the international community, Putin has rallied the international community around Ukraine in a sense and isolated himself. Even China is taking a very low profile now because they're not quite sure how far they want to go alongside an invasion that may not work.
Indeed, indeed. You know, when we think about Russia moving towards the West, we heard that Germany, I beg your pardon, has allocated an extra 2% for defense reasons. Kosovo's reached out and basically said, you know, we need help, take us in on this, take us into the EU. A lot of neighboring countries are starting to either be worried or get paranoid, or however way you want to call it. But are these, are these valid issues? Could that be his master plan to invade, I don't want to say Europe, but get back his Soviet states at least?
Well, certainly with Ukraine, he wanted to make it part of Greater Russia. And I think possibly keep your eyes on Moldova. I think that's always been a case where Moldova could have been vulnerable. But by and large, Putin's not talking about direct military operations. Ukraine's the exception here. What you're talking about is hybrid operations that have been going on for, well, 15 years now. Cyber operations against the Baltic states, economic threats and sabotage of the Baltic states, which has backfired because they've drawn closer to the EU and to NATO. He's threatened Balkan states. He's trying to push an alliance with Serbia to put pressure on others, which is why Kosovo's reacted the way that it has. He is also, as I mentioned, pushing around the southern part of Russia, including Moldova. But I think you put your finger on it. I think Putin, good tactician, terrible strategist. What he succeeded in doing is even taking countries like Sweden and Finland, who have not been NATO members, who have resolutely stood outside of NATO, but now are drawing closer to NATO, in effect almost with associate status, where they're collaborating with them. Because let me reverse Putin's narrative. Putin's never been the victim of NATO. It was never the case that NATO was going to go in and attack Moscow, was going to undermine Russia. What happened is countries like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia said, we want to be members of NATO because we don't ever want to face a threat from another country. Well, if Vladimir Putin is trying to occupy Ukraine, what kind of message does it send to others who may be thinking, we really would prefer NATO being alongside us rather than being vulnerable?
Right, exactly. No, I'm not surprised. I want to flip the coin on this with you a second. Let's do a hypothetical. Now, we know that Russia is actually experiencing severe sanctions. This is affecting the people, the 144 million people that live in Russia. Now, they're having trouble getting their money out of the banks. We've seen the footage and whatnot. But do they have the might, the willpower, the gumption to oust their president if they wanted to, even?
No, I don't think we're talking about the overthrow of Vladimir Putin because he's closed down the Russian political space step by step. You may remember the constitutional, quote, reform last year that guarantees he can stay in office till 2036 if he wishes. You can remember the stage-managed elections, which I think he would have won, but he's massaged, 80, 85% support. And a lot of Russians do or have supported Putin. The issue here is that you sort of erode that support, not to overthrow Putin, but to affect his decision-making. If more and more Russians, even if they're not actively coming out on the streets, are expressing discontent, saying, where's my next meal coming from? Can I get my money out of the banks? Do I have a roof over my head? That means this war on Ukraine becomes a drain. It becomes a drain on what you try to do to build up at home. And it ultimately presents Putin with a decision, which is how far do you go with occupying another country if it means damaging, if not destroying your own country in the process?
Well, they can't oust him, though, so what do they do? Is it just going to be revolt, civil war, internal displacement, people leaving Russia? What happens next to... I mean, we can't blame the Russians for Putin's actions.
No. You remember Afghanistan in the 1980s? Different continent.
Sure.
40 years ago. 10-year insurgency, and it never resulted in the overthrow of a Soviet leader. Didn't overthrow Brezhnev, Andropov, Chernenko. They died conveniently. Didn't overthrow Gorbachev. Instead, what it did is it sapped the Soviet economy, and it caused disruption within the Soviet political system where people questioned the entire system. So Mikhail Gorbachev didn't fall from power, but the Soviet system collapsed in part because of episodes like Afghanistan. So the real thing to watch out for here is not if Vladimir Putin gets overthrown, but if Vladimir Putin tries to cling on, does the entire Russian system as it is constructed right now start building itself up for a crisis? Because again, there's another problem here. When Putin narrowed down the Russian political system, he has not really put a successor in place. You don't know where they go to next. And when you give the Russian people the choice of all or nothing, me or nothing, and me is winding up destroying the country, well, people may choose the vacuum. That's the risk that Putin faces and that Russia, to be honest with you, faces.
And last question, so I know you're a busy man. I always appreciate your time here. These oligarchs that are Putin's friends and close allies, when they start feeling the pressure of this internet, the lack of access to their inner wealth, are they likely to turn on him?
Well, I'm just going to tell you two stories and let your viewers decide. The first is, keep your eyes on yachts. And I mean the big yachts, the mega yachts that Russian businessmen like to flaunt. A lot of them are returning back to Russia right now from where they have been, and they're doing so very quickly. And why is that? So they're not confiscated. Secondly, a guy named Roman Abramovich. Now, I'm not going to accuse Roman Abramovich of being an oligarch. I'm going to call him a businessman, one of Russia's richest businessmen. But he had a significant stake in Chelsea Football Club. As a UK football fan, supporting another team, I keep an eye on this. Roman Abramovich has just divested his stakes from Chelsea Football Club, gotten his money out of Chelsea Football Club. And secondly, he has said today that he will support efforts to stop the war. So make of that of what you may in terms of how Russian businessmen or so-called Russian oligarchs are making their calculations, even though we're less than a week into this war.
Indeed, indeed. Right, we're out of time. Just a quick question: are you an Aston Villa fan?
No, for my sins, I started in this country at Leeds, so I'm a Leeds United FC fan.
Oh, unlucky. Anyway, on a happy note there. Okay, Scott, thank you so much for joining us here at Anews. Always a pleasure to see your face and your insight. Very valuable indeed. Okay.